picture this. It's 1943. World War II is raging. The Allies, Britain and America mostly, knew what they had to do next. They had to invade Europe. They had to land a huge army on the French coast, push back Hitler's forces, and finally end the war. Simple in theory, right? But it was anything but simple. This wasn't just any invasion. This would be the biggest seaborne invasion in history. Hitler knew it was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. The question wasn't if, but where and when. And that was the Allies' massive problem. Hitler had built what he called the Atlantic Wall. It was a line of fortifications, bunkers, gun emplacements all along the coast. He had hundreds of thousands of troops stationed there. If the Allies landed where he expected them, it would be a bloodbath. The invasion would likely fail. And if it failed, the war would drag on for who knows how much longer. The cost in lives would be unimaginable, so the generals sat in their war rooms. They looked at maps, they moved little flags around, they knew they needed a plan that was more than just military might. They needed something clever, something sneaky. They needed to trick Hitler. They needed to make him believe the invasion was happening somewhere it wasn't. Or that it was happening later than it really would. They needed to fool him so completely that he would keep his best troops, his powerful panzer tank divisions, away from the real landing zones. This wasn't just about winning a battle, this was about saving countless lives. If Hitler diverted his forces, even for a few crucial days, it could make all the difference. It could turn a potential disaster into a victory. But how do you trick a dictator who is paranoid and has a vast intelligence network? How do you hide an army of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and ships, all getting ready to cross a channel? You don't. You make him think you have two armies, one real and one completely fake. That's where the crazy idea came in. What if they could create a phantom army, an army that didn't exist? An army made of air, literally. Imagine trying to convince someone you have a massive force ready to strike, but all your tanks are just rubber. Your trucks are canvas, your planes are just frames. It sounds like something out of a cartoon. It sounds impossible, but that's exactly what they decided to try. They would build an illusion. A massive, intricate, convincing illusion designed to make Hitler look the wrong way. It wasn't just about putting a few fake tanks on a field. It had to be real enough to fool German spy planes flying overhead. Real enough to fool German spies on the ground. Real enough to fool Hitler's top generals who would be reporting back to him. Every detail had to be perfect, the size of the army, the equipment it supposedly had, the radio signals it sent, even the gossip spread by double agents. Everything had to tell the same lie. This was a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about bullets and bombs, at least not directly. It was about minds, it was about psychology, it was about playing a trick on one of the most dangerous men in history. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If they failed, the true invasion would face the full force of the German war machine. If they succeeded, it could shorten the war and save generations. This wasn't just a tactic. It was a gamble, a very, very big gamble. And it all started with a simple, almost unbelievable thought: what if we just pretend? What if we just make it up? What if we just inflate a bunch of rubber tanks? This idea, this wild, audacious plan, became known as Operation Fortitude. It was a masterpiece of deception. It was a stage play on the biggest stage imaginable, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. And the main props, well, a lot of them were filled with air. Okay, so who came up with this crazy plan? It wasn't just one guy having a light bulb moment. It was a whole group of smart, often unconventional people. These were the experts in trickery. They were called the London Controlling Section in Britain, and similar groups were in the US. They understood that war wasn't just about brute force, it was about outsmarting the enemy. The idea of strategic deception wasn't new. Armies had been trying to fool each other for centuries. But this was different. This was on an industrial scale. This was about fooling an entire nation and its leader, about the biggest military operation ever. The overall goal for this massive trick, Operation Fortitude, was simple: make the Germans believe the main invasion of Europe would happen somewhere other than Normandy. And not just anywhere else. They wanted Hitler to think it was coming in Pas-de-Calais. Why Pas-de-Calais? Look at a map. It's the closest point between England and France. It's the most logical place to cross the English Channel. It's where the Germans expected it. And that was the genius of it. You make them believe what they already want to believe. You feed their assumptions, you reinforce their prejudices. Hitler was already convinced the invasion would come there. So, the Allies decided to give him all the proof he needed. Operation Fortitude actually had two main parts: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North was designed to make the Germans worry about an invasion of Norway. This wasn't the main event, but it was important. It tied up German troops in Scandinavia, keeping them away from France. The army for Fortitude North was supposedly built around the British Fourth Army, which didn't really exist. They created fake radio traffic, made up troop movements, and used double agents to hint at this northern threat. It worked well enough to keep some German divisions stuck up north, looking at the fjords instead of the French coast. But the real star, the main act, was Fortitude South. This was the big one. Its job was to convince Hitler that a huge army, far bigger than the actual invasion force, was gathering in southeast England, directly opposite Pas-de-Calais. This fake army was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSOG for short, and its commander was General George S. Patton. Now, Patton was a real general, a very famous and feared one. The Germans knew him, they respected him, and they worried about him. So, putting him in charge of this fake army was a stroke of genius. It gave FUSOG instant credibility. It made the Germans think, oh no, Patton is there. This must be the main invasion force. They didn't know Patton was actually in England, but just driving around, visiting real units, and making himself visible enough to fuel the rumors. The deception playbook for FUSOG was incredibly detailed. It wasn't just about tanks. It was about creating an entire fake infrastructure. Think about it. An army needs camps, supply depots, hospitals, airfields. It needs roads to move on. It needs ships to cross the water. The Allies had to fake all of it. They had to create ghost towns of military equipment. They also used information. They controlled every bit of information that might reach German intelligence. This meant using double agents. These were German spies who had been captured by the British and turned. They now worked for the Allies, sending back carefully crafted false reports to their German handlers. These reports confirmed everything the Allies wanted Hitler to believe: the size of FUSOG, its location, its readiness, and its ultimate target, Pas-de-Calais. The deception was layered. It used visual tricks for German spy planes, it used radio tricks to fool German listening stations, it used human sources of double agency to give the facts a personal touch. And it used a very clever understanding of Hitler's own mind. They knew he was stubborn. They knew he often didn't trust his own generals, and they knew he liked to believe what he already suspected. So, they fed him exactly what he wanted to hear. This whole operation was like a massive movie production, but with real lives at stake. Every actor had a part, every prop had a purpose, and the audience was Hitler himself. And the script was written to make him believe the biggest lie of the war. It was a bold move, a daring gamble, and it took a lot of smart, creative people to pull it off. They weren't just soldiers, they were illusionists. So, how do you make a fake army look real? You need fake equipment, lots of it. And this is where the inflatable tanks come in. This wasn't just some half-baked idea, this was a sophisticated, thought-out plan. The British had been experimenting with dummy equipment for a while. They knew that from the air, a lot of things look similar if done right. The star of this show was the inflatable tank. Imagine a Sherman tank, a big, powerful war machine. Now imagine it made mostly of rubber and canvas. When deflated, it could be folded up and carried by a couple of men. But when inflated with air, it would stand up, taking on the exact shape and size of a real tank. These weren't just crude balloons, they were designed to mimic the exact contours and details of tanks like the M4 Sherman or the British Challenger. They had turrets, gun barrels, tracks, all painted to look real. From a spy plane flying thousands of feet up, they were almost impossible to tell apart from the real thing. The challenges were huge. They needed thousands of these, not just tanks, but inflatable trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even airplanes. Think about it, an army needs more than just fighting vehicles. It needs logistical support. So they made inflatable trucks to mimic supply convoys. They made inflatable jeeps. They made inflatable artillery to suggest big guns were ready. They even made fake landing craft, designed to look like they were massing in the harbors along the English coast, ready to transport the fake army across the channel. And it wasn't just inflatables. They also used wooden frames covered with canvas to build fake vehicles. Sometimes they just used cleverly arranged tarpaulins to suggest hidden vehicles or equipment. The idea was to create the appearance of depth and scale. These fake items were handled by special units. One of the most famous was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, often called the Ghost Army. This was an American unit, and their job was pure theatrical deception. They had about 1,100 men, but their mission was to impersonate an entire army of 30,000 or more. They weren't fighting soldiers in the traditional sense. They were artists, engineers, sound technicians, and actors. These guys were masters of illusion. They would set up fake command posts, complete with fake radio antennas and realistic-looking tents. They would move their inflatable tanks around at night, setting them up in new positions by morning to suggest a large, active army on the move. They would drive a few real tanks or trucks in circles to create track marks in the mud, making it look like a much larger convoy had passed through. The Ghost Army also used sound. They had special sound trucks equipped with powerful speakers. They would play recordings of tanks rumbling, soldiers shouting, artillery firing, all at different times and places. Imagine hearing the distant sound of an army moving, but there's nothing real there. A German listening post would pick up these sounds, adding to the illusion, and radio deception was critical. Real radio operators would mimic the actual radio traffic of a large army. They would send fake messages, use specific call signs, and create the kind of chatter and volume you'd expect from a massive military formation. This was designed to fool German radio intelligence, which was constantly monitoring Allied communications. They had to be careful not to make it too perfect or too obvious. They made small mistakes that a real army might make to add to the authenticity. The sheer logistics of this were incredible. They needed factories to produce all these inflatable items. They needed teams to transport them, inflate them, paint them, and move them around. And they had to do all this without the Germans figuring out it was fake. It meant constant vigilance, careful planning, and a lot of secrecy. They were creating a phantom army so convincing that it could trick an entire intelligence apparatus. It took imagination, resourcefulness, and a willingness to try something completely new and outlandish. These weren't just soldiers, they were artists of war, painting a picture of overwhelming force with rubber, air, and sound. And that picture was designed to keep Hitler's attention fixed on the wrong target. With the fake army, the inflatable tanks, and the ghost radio traffic all in place, the Allies began their grand performance. The stage was Southeast England, and the audience was Hitler and his generals. The show was called Operation Fortitude South. The Ghost Army and other deception units played their roles perfectly. They moved their fake tanks and trucks around the countryside. They inflated their rubber vehicles in open fields, creating vast visible formations that German reconnaissance planes could easily spot. When the spy planes flew over, they would see what looked like thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces all lined up, ready for battle. They would see bustling encampments, even if those encampments were mostly empty tents and clever camouflage. But it wasn't just about what the Germans could see, it was about what they heard and what they were told. The radio deception was relentless. From listening posts in France, German intelligence picked up a massive surge in radio traffic from southeast England. It sounded like an enormous army communicating, coordinating, planning. They heard the distinctive voices of American radio operators using call signs that implied huge units, all operating under the command of General Patton. And then there were the double agents. These guys were crucial. They were feeding reliable intelligence directly to the German high command. These agents would send messages saying things like, "Confirmed, the 1st U.S. Army Group under Patton is concentrated in Kent. Their objectives are Pas de Calais. They are preparing to embark." Because these agents had been deemed trustworthy by the Germans over time, their reports were given high credence. They were the final, crucial pieces of the puzzle, reinforcing everything else the Germans were seeing and hearing. This continuous stream of false information built up a very convincing picture. German intelligence assessed that the 1st U.S. Army Group was a real and powerful force, consisting of many divisions, far more than the actual force that would invade Normandy. And they believed it was poised to strike at Pas de Calais. Why were the Germans so susceptible to this trick? Well, there are a few reasons. First, Pas de Calais was, as mentioned, the most logical invasion point. It's the shortest distance across the channel, making it the easiest place to supply an invading force. German military doctrine would have naturally assumed the Allies would pick the most direct route. Second, Hitler himself had a significant blind spot. He was famously stubborn and often ignored advice from his own generals if it contradicted his gut feelings. He mistrusted his intelligence officers, even though they were often quite good at their jobs. He had a fixed idea in his head that Pas de Calais was the place. The Allied deception teams knew this. They understood his psychology. They knew that if they fed him information that confirmed his existing beliefs, he would be more likely to accept it without question. Hitler also believed in a powerful reserve force, a second wave that would follow the initial invasion. The Allies played into this by making Fusag look so huge that it could easily be seen as the primary invading force, with the real Normandy invasion as a diversion. He was convinced that even if the Allies landed elsewhere, the main attack, the real attack, would come at Pas de Calais. He would hold back his most powerful tank divisions, his panzer units, waiting for this real invasion. So, as the weeks turned into months, the Germans kept their eyes fixed on Pas-de-Calais. Hitler insisted on keeping the 15th Army, a massive force of German infantry and armored divisions, positioned there. He refused to move them even when his generals suggested that troop concentrations in Normandy looked suspiciously real. He was waiting for Patton's main attack. He was waiting for the real invasion that would never come. The Allies watched as their deception worked. They saw German forces staying put, not moving to reinforce the Normandy sector. Every day that Hitler kept his panzers in Pas-de-Calais was a victory for the deception artists. The performance was flawless, and the audience, tragically for them, was completely captivated by the illusion. For June 6, 1944, this was D-Day, the real invasion. Thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy. It was the moment everyone had been working towards for years. But for Operation Fortitude, it was the climax of the performance. As the first waves of Allied troops hit the beaches, the Germans reacted, of course. They sent their local defenders to fight. But the crucial part was what Hitler didn't do. He still believed the Normandy landings were a diversion. He still believed that the main invasion, the real invasion led by Patton, was coming at Pas-de-Calais. So he held back his reserves, he kept powerful panzer divisions, some of the best fighting units in the German army, sitting idle in Pas-de-Calais. He refused to release them to rush to the aid of the beleaguered German forces in Normandy. He was waiting. Waiting for the Fusag to show up, waiting for the rubber tanks to somehow become real and roll across the beaches near Calais. Even after D-Day was well underway, the Allies continued the deception. They kept the fake radio traffic going. They continued moving their inflatable tanks around. The double agents kept sending messages confirming that Fusag was still preparing to attack Pas-de-Calais, that the Normandy landings were just a feint. This was called holding the deception. It was vital to keep Hitler convinced for as long as possible. And it worked. For crucial days, even weeks, after D-Day, Hitler kept those vital reserves tied up. This gave the Allied forces in Normandy precious time to consolidate their beachheads, bring in more troops and supplies, and push inland. Without those German tank divisions counterattacking immediately, the fighting in Normandy would have been far, far harder. The Allied casualties would have been much higher. The entire invasion could have been pushed back into the sea. The success of D-Day wasn't just about the bravery of the soldiers or the might of the ships and planes. It was also about the cleverness of the deception. Operation Fortitude bought the Allies time. It bought them a critical advantage at the most important moment of the war. It's hard to put a number on how many lives were saved, or how many weeks or months the war might have been shortened, but it was undoubtedly significant. The Ghost Army, with their inflatable tanks and sound effects, stayed on duty even after the real invasion. They continued to move around, creating the illusion of a massive force still threatening Pas-de-Calais until late summer. Only when the Allied breakout from Normandy was firmly established and the Germans were in full retreat did the deception fully end. The legacy of this operation is huge. It showed that intelligence and psychological warfare could be as powerful as bombs and bullets. It proved that a well-executed lie could be a decisive weapon. It was a testament to human ingenuity and the power of thinking outside the box, even in the most desperate of times. The story of the inflatable tanks and the Ghost Army remained a secret for decades after the war. The men who pulled off this incredible feat were sworn to secrecy. It wasn't until the 1980s that their full story began to emerge. And when it did, people were amazed. It was a forgotten chapter of courage and cleverness. It was proof that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a weapon at all, it's a trick. It's a phantom army made of rubber and air that tricked one of the most powerful dictators in history and helped change the course of the war. It was a gamble that paid off, big time. It was an army of illusions that helped win a real war. The Allies created a world that didn't exist, and they did it so well that Hitler believed it more than the reality unfolding right in front of him. That, I think, is pretty amazing.